Well, thanks very much, Catherine. It's great to be back at Notre Dame, where I've visited a number of times, and to be introduced by Catherine. We've known one another for a quarter of a century, something like that, as colleagues in the American Political Science Association. So I do appreciate her taking time to offer those good words. Evidently, they're going to keep fiddling with the audio in here, but I will just continue. Can you hear me in the back?
I'm trying to see now, it's hard to even take its measure.
That sounded like Tommy Lee Jones. Maybe they're having clips in that other. All right, hold on for a minute. I think I'm okay.
Yeah, the next person won't need the microphone.
Oh. Jim, I should just keep talking. Okay. You know what, this is just in my way. 55 years ago, C.S. Lewis faced an audience to deliver his inaugural lecture for a newly minted chair at Cambridge University. And he begins the lecture entitled De Descriptione Temporum, a description of the times, in a disarmingly simple way. He tells us how pleased he is that both medieval and Renaissance are combined in the commission for this newly founded chair. This is a very good thing, he says, as medieval and Renaissance, that dichotomy does not hold any longer. Indeed, it never did, no matter how assiduously promoted by those who railed against the Dark Ages as a period of superstition, backwardness, misogyny, unfreedom, a veritable gallery of horrors. This picture, so dominant for so long, was largely, he tells us, a figment of humanist propaganda. It follows that flexibility in periodization is welcome. Strict periodization invites a great deal of both ignorance and superstition, as represented, for example, in the words of a scholar cited by Lewis, who spends much of his time, he tells us, cataloging the unrelieved gloom of the Middle Ages, in which oppression of all sorts pertained, including cruelty to children. Thankfully, Lewis notes wryly, light penetrated the darkness in the form of the Copernican doctrine. We are, he continues, to assume that a new hypothesis in astronomy naturally makes man stop hitting his daughter about the head. At this juncture, Lewis segues into his major theme, which is change, and how we might find a way to structure and organize material that does not fall into the temptation to resurrect the great divide between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Do we then put a great divide anywhere, even as we strive to avoid grand philosophies of history, a matter on which Lewis describes himself as a desperate skeptic? Well, we do know this much about change. It is never total, and it is never complete. And this drives ambitious world changers daft, but it is a historic truth that cannot be gainsaid. Now, Lewis's ambitions are more modest. How do we sort things out and try to make intelligible that which might otherwise seem a jumble of unrelated observations? Let's pick up the thread of his argument. He observes that three things have happened since the time of Edward Gibbon. The reader, you'll recall that Gibbon is the relentlessly anti-Christian author of that enduring classic on the fall of the Roman Empire. And Gibbon makes the alleged catastrophe, or a theme of his, is the alleged catastrophe as antiquity gave way to the Middle Ages. So, what's happened? What are those three things? First, the partial loss of ancient learning that Gibbon makes much of as a total loss and a purposeful one was not in fact part of some sinister plot to destroy antique scholarship. Indeed, one needs to remember, and here I'm passing his point, that it was all those anonymous monks in cold scriptoria laboring under conditions that would fell most of us who preserved the pre-Christian world for posterity. Consider by contrast, Lewis says, our own time, modernity, where the death of ancient learning Pre-Christian learning, he's referring to now, is far more stark, systematic, and by design. I'm quoting, "If one were looking for a man who could not read Virgil, though his father could, he might be more easily found in the 20th century than in the 5th. But no one speaks of this as a catastrophe." This leads to Lewis's second related point, namely that literary change from Virgil to Beowulf seemed greater in an earlier time than it does for us. Epics are recognizable across time, and the so-called barbarian poems were a kind of unconscious return to the spirit of the earliest classical poetry. The third, and no doubt most salient point for our consideration, is that the christening of Europe, deplored by humanistic unbelievers, seemed irreversible. But we have seen the opposite process, Lewis writes. To be sure, the unchristening of Europe in our time, he tells us, remember this is 1954, is not quite complete, but it proceeds apace. We must now speak, he tells us, of post-Christian Europe. This is the cultural change that really grabs Lewis's attention. It is a far more radical change than that from the antique world to the Christian. Lewis notes that Christians and pagans had much more in common with one another than either has with a post-Christian. Now, this was a breathtaking and prescient observation in 1954. Now widely acknowledged, few at the time shared Lewis's mordant observation that Europe was abandoning her Christian heritage. There were signs of weakening and slackness, but Europe becoming deeply post and even in some ways anti-Christian, surely not. Is it ready? Let's give it a try. I won't have to shout. I won't have to shout at you. All right. Lewis sensed. Is that better? Yeah. All right. Lewis sensed some profound cultural shifts at work, transformations that seemed to move at a snail's pace, but constituted quite speeded up change compared to previous epochs. Now, as I understand Lewis, he's telling us that in losing the Christian narrative, one loses a world of, in his words, externalized and enacted ideas, sort of layers of sedimented meaning. My colleague at Chicago, Jean-Luc Marion, would like to call this saturated symbols, kind of depth of meaning. The loss of these signs and symbols narrows the range of language and thought. Language becomes impoverished, more designative, if you will. Borrow from Charles Taylor's unpacking of the expressivist and designativist language worlds. With this loss of meaning, this loss of evocative language and symbols, there is a correlative loss of meaning. The insistence that there is some telos, some purposivity to human life beyond the mere instrumental, falters. It is nigh impossible to cover the entire range of these changes and what they might portend. The upshot of this discussion is that changes in Lewis's own time, he tells us, are far more portentous than those that mark the transition from ancient to medieval. Quote, "I do not think that the change from dark to middle can, on the literary side, be judged equal to the change which has taken place in my lifetime. And of course, in religion, it does not even begin to compete," he writes. Perhaps, therefore, we might want to consider another possible frontier, and he muses about this by drawing a line somewhere towards the end of the 17th century. We find general acceptance of Copernicanism. We find the narrowing ratiocination of Descartes' cogito as definitory of the human, thereby enshrining disembodied reason as greater than the reasoning of the ensouled body, as greater than love. Is this where the history of our culture takes a decisive turn? Lewis turns the matter over in his mind repeatedly for his initial conclusion on examining the evidence, that from the literary point of view, the greatest of all divisions in the history of the West is that which divides the present present from, say, the age of Jane Austen, that initially seemed too extreme to him. But he comes repeatedly back to the same conclusion. How so? Well, there are four sorts of reasons, he tells us, for his insistence on a chasm separating his time from Jane Austen's that is far deeper and wider than any separating the so-called Middle Ages from the Renaissance. The first and the weakest reason is change in the political order. In previous ages, he argues, rulers aimed to promote domestic tranquility, to keep order, to restore, to retain order, some measure of justice. People pretty much got on with their lives that were lived in a relatively quiet way, free from what we might today call excessive politicization. Now, he continues, political leaders insist on keeping everything in a hubbub. Mass excitement and agitation are ongoingly generated. The state now aims much higher, if that is the correct way to put it, and seeks to manage or to control more and more aspects of human life. A second change is one best characterized as bewildering at best, shattering at worst. Namely, there is simply no agreement any longer on the meaning of vital terms. Words have been reduced to a sequence of subjectivist claims. A third change is a religious one, namely the unchristening of the West. Religious belief and practices are no longer the norm. A post-Christian man, he notes provocatively, is not a pagan. The post-Christian is cut off from the Christian past and therefore doubly from the pagan past. And this means perforce that the past may one day be well and truly lost, for you cannot revive the antique world without at the same time reviving its Christianization. The latter is increasingly unacceptable. The past must be cut adrift as well, the pre-Christian past. Fourth, and Lewis's trump card in the argument, is what he calls the birth of the machine. It means a kind of techno rationality that overtakes other forms of reasoning and ways of being in the world. This alters the human place in nature. Archetypes dominate. We move quickly from one machine to the next, and this becomes our concept of change. The previous machine is quite literally worthless. It is junk. Just go to any dump. It's refuse. In the early medieval Christian era, reminds us nothing was really destroyed outright, but it was reused, it was harvested to other purposes. The past helped quite literally to provide the foundation and the walls for the buildings of the present. Now all becomes provisional. Nothing is built to last. The very milestones of life are technical advances, he notes. And rereading this, I was thinking of the outpouring at the death of Steve Jobs and how extraordinary that was. I know my grandchildren were much affected by it because he's a kind of hero, and part of it is these wonderful new machines that came out every so often, and you had to have the latest iteration. The old one was no good anymore. It was already an antique in a couple of years. I'm not demonizing the poor man, don't get me wrong, but I think it helps to illustrate, what Lewis is talking about. Television is the most, or was the most, rapidly disseminated new technology in the history of humankind. As with so much else, television represented the attainment of a good we had never yet had, rather than the defense and conservation of those we have already. So goods we don't have but yearn for, that's what we want, rather than to think about what needs to be preserved. Now, if one finds something of worth, he continues, in the old, one is accused of nostalgia, of a form of enslavement to a romanticized past. Past is always called romanticized if you are defending some part of it. I remember having a conversation with my late friend, the historian Christopher Lasch, before he died. And he said, died too young, and he said it would probably be worth exploring those accusations of nostalgia. When do those come forward? What is it you're talking about when you're accused of nostalgia? Because it's probably something very important and very precious to explore. I want to avoid thinking about it by labeling it nostalgic and not dealing with it at all. Although Lewis does not develop this particular theme, the accusation of nostalgia, one can tie views of temporality to understanding of the machine age. That is, the ancient world held, as you know, that there were recurrent cycles. Human beings had only so much efficacy in relation to this cyclicity. See the way this works in Machiavelli's The Prince. Machiavelli, having revived the classical view as he took it as against the Christian. Now Machiavelli stresses the force of what he calls the bitch goddess Fortuna. She rushes over some peoples and places like a destructive torrent. On others she shines and distributes her favors. So there's not so much change as repetition. But with Christianity, one witnesses the breaking into temporality of the eternal. This is a theme struck by Robert Marcus in his classic work, St. Augustine, known to some of you, I'm sure, called Secularism. Emphasis on time and this new, rich, profound meaning infused into history. So history is no longer simply the repetition of events. It is possible for the new to occur and for real change to enter and become a permanent part, a permanent feature of a landscape ever altered. This did not commit Christian theologians to anything like later notions of progress, but the new ideas of temporality, the breaking into history of the unexpected, and history changed as a result, all this added great weightiness to earthly arrangements rather than detracting from them. So over time, more was expected from earthly actors as we move from ancient and medieval to modern. And none of this would, he tells us, would be possible without the Christian presupposition of free will. Now, tragically, and here I'm developing some of my own themes, free will transmogrified in the 20th century into a triumph of the will. That is, the will must impose itself on history, make change according to how the powerful will it. And here politics as mass excitement, as huge ambition for earthly regeneration could now be entertained. Our understandings of the self transformed radically as we determined we could control more and more aspects of our lives, both individually and collectively. We were whipsawed in between Fortuna made them do it and to a new version of the absolute sovereignty of the self, which is our modern mythology. The contemporary sovereign self aims at perfect control to eliminate all fortuities. And one sees this drive for mastery at work in the technocratic understanding of our ability to manipulate, to obtain the outcomes we desire in the name of choice and control. We will weed out poor products and imperfect models, including flawed human beings. Characteristic of all projects of self-sovereignty is a triumph over something, nature being one of the chosen antagonists. Now, such selves, these sovereign selves, are surely less governable, which brings us to the question of authority. Now, Lewis didn't do this. I'm developing based on my reading of his essay. Now, Hannah Arendt famously argued that authority had died. A rich understanding of authority had died in the modern world. Real authority, auctoritas, is unavailable to us, for that draws us away from our absolute self-sovereignty. That is, we cannot authorize anyone else, cannot insist that some possess legitimate authority to govern or to interpret or to teach. One of the mantras of the 1960s, and I remember it very well, was to question authority or crush authority, not illegitimate power, right, which would have been something different, but authority itself. Now, in an era when all is provisional and nothing is built to last, why should we fret? Why should we care? Why is this a problem? Now, let's go back to Lewis for a moment. He tells us he will focus on these basic questions in his position in his new chair. He says he will be the spokesman of the old Western culture, an alarming idea to many because it suggests enslavement of the past. That, he tells us, is precisely not what it is. It is not the remembered past, but the forgotten past that enslaves us, he says. To study the past helps to liberate us from the idols of our own time, our own marketplace, and from a rigid and inflexible past well. We now insistently misidentify the past and misinterpret it. We are remembering wrongly as we fail to get inside that which is to be interpreted. And the ancient Athenians, he tells us, would know in his bones that so much that we seek is vain. Now he concludes by likening himself to a dinosaur named Old Western Man. But we can perhaps learn something from this specimen, he continues, even as his numbers dwindle, and we will awaken one day to find that he is extinct. Were Lewis yet with us, I think he would be disheartened that the Old Western man's numbers are shockingly small, and Old Western woman's too. Lewis, I take him to be using man inclusively, but he would be heartened by the fact that in the hearts and souls of many ordinary people, the Christian story yet blazes, and with it the determination to cherish and to bring forward the collective endeavors of simple believers who in their own way went about the Lord's work. Now let's leap forward a half century to the troubles of the present, as articulated so eloquently by the current Pope. The Christian narrative has been under assault for decades, pounded by the force fields of technological change and cultural renunciation and cultural denunciation, it must be said. So to sum up this first part of my talk, nearly 60 years ago now, C.S. Lewis feared that the light was flickering and could well be blown out unless we accurately remembered and clearly interpreted. There's no romanticism here, no sentimentality here, but rather certain cold, hard truth, according to Lewis. That is, there are better and worse ways to live. There are worthy and less worthy projects. There are ways to ill-dignify human beings, or by contrast, to recognize their dignity, right? And there is, of course, hope and joy and simple decency. So let's move ahead and look at Europe right now. Many of you, I'm sure, my focus will be on Europe. That's Benedict's focus. And there's always a question as to whether the United States, America, constitutes an exception to what's happening in Europe. Is it a partial exception, or are we bound to go the way that Europe goes, finally? And I'll just leave that as a question hanging in the air for you. But I'm sure you've had this experience. If you visit some of the great cathedrals in Europe, you find only a few people usually at worship during times when worship is what's supposed to be happening there. Everybody else is a tourist. You see more people with cameras hanging around their necks than you see people at worship. In 2006, I was in Edinburgh giving some lectures, and I read a newspaper story commenting on the fact that there was something like 300 little deserted churches dotting the Scottish countryside, these wee little kirks tucked away everywhere, not being used. And the question was, should they be destroyed, or could enterprising entrepreneurs turn them into bars and cafes? And the conclusion was, yes, they could be put to use in that way. We didn't have to waste the good structure. Now, Europe herself, as you know, in the proposed preamble to a European constitution, you know this, refused to acknowledge, this is in the preamble, refused to acknowledge the heritage of Judaism and Christianity, although Greece and Rome, the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, were all noted. Now, I would submit that Europe cannot remember who she is unless she remembers that she is a child not only of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds and the Enlightenment, but also Judaism and Christianity, the child, therefore, Catholicism and the Reformation. If Europe abandons her religious heritage, the idea of Europe, I would submit, dies, of what Europe has represented. Europe has abandoned or is in the process of abandoning this heritage. Europe is now definitely post-Christian. And this phenomenon that Lewis named all those years ago. So what does this mean and what does it portend? What does this mean and what does it portend? So for contemporary Europe, the window to transcendence, transcendent meaning and purpose and possibility, is closed or has been slammed shut. Again, something identified many years ago by Albert Camus, for example, in his great essay, The Rebel, where he says beyond the earth now there's only the empty sky. Transcendence has been eliminated. Human values alone pertain. But these human values are shriveled by a prior loss of the conviction that there is anything to defend about the human person. Instead, values are seen as subjectivist construals without any defensible content. So unsurprisingly, what comes to prevail is a crude form of utilitarianism. And the self, as I've mentioned with the thoughts about self-sovereignty, becomes one's property. It's a self shorn of any encumbrances of the past and the shackles of old moralities. The question of what the self is, whether the self has any transcendent meaning, often is answered with a shrug. It's a question that doesn't register for millions. Now, the late John Paul II saw the result of the belief that we are sovereigns of ourselves, wholly self-possessing. He understood what the result of that would be. In Evangelium Vitae, he writes, if the promotion of the self is understood in terms of absolute autonomy, people inevitably reach the point of rejecting one another. Everyone else is considered an enemy from whom one has to defend oneself. Society becomes a mass of individuals placed side by side without any mutual bonds. So we come closer to that world characterized by Hobbes in his imagining of the state of nature. Someone may attach a value to us, and this is Hobbes as well. We can attach values. We may have a market price, so to speak, but we don't have a dignity. Should no one attach value to us, or should one be too bereft or wounded to attach to themselves, we perforce become dispensable. And the final triumph of this notion will be a world in which the powerful have their way simply because they can, and because the ethical and moral barriers to taking what they want have been lost. Over time, we could see the diminution of a basic commitment to certain fundamental human rights. And I don't mean rights as a sort of shopping list of the things we want, but rights as one way that we name human dignity. Those may come to be seen arbitrary constructions that can be revoked because there is nothing intrinsic about human beings such that they are not to be ill-treated or violated, or even killed. Even now, many do not want to be bothered with the infirm elderly or aged infants. So we devise so-called humane ways to kill them and pretend that they chose this, or if they would have chosen this. And we know, there are ample studies of this now, that there are elderly patients being killed in the Netherlands without their consent. And I'm not saying consent would make it all right, but we know that this is going on. We know this as well. There's a new protocol. Well, it's not so new now. It's been in place for 3 or 4 years for euthanizing newborns with disabilities, institutionalized in the Netherlands. And the Dr. Verhagen, who authored these protocols, tells us that, in fact, it is beautiful when these troubled newborns have been euthanized, because then at last they are at peace. The philosopher Peter Singer predicts confidently, who is at Princeton, as you know, that the superstition that human life is sacred, put this on your calendars, will definitively be put to rest by 2040. So you might note that down. Some of you will be alive then. It doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to suggest that by that moment, certain forms of life unworthy of life will routinely be destroyed in the name of humanitarianism and compassion and cost effectiveness. Those are the cluster of arguments now being made. This is entirely consistent with the view that we are only meat walking around, and we can be turned easily into means to the ends of others, just as we may turn others into means our ends. It's the old master-slave scenario come to life. Now, while Catholicism has become a champion of human rights and of democracy as the political form that supports human dignity most fully, much secular reason is increasingly manifesting itself, as you know, as secularism, by which I mean a rigid cultural ideology that construes religion as superstition and celebrates a certain very narrow rationalism as the only way to think and to be in the world. Right? To think and to be in the world. And this narrows the boundary of our understanding, constricts the boundary of our understanding of humanity. You know, who can reason in this way, who can be productive in the way that the econometric way that we measure the worth of human life. I would submit that no good has ever come from this process of constricting our understanding of humanity. The Jerusalem side of the European heritage tells us that all are equally children of God. The disabled, the bad-smelling, the confused, the lonely, all require our care and concern. As the anti-Nazi German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it, even the most wretched life is worth living before God. For 3 centuries, Europe was defined in and through, in roughly modernity, in and through a complex dialectic and dialogue between belief and unbelief. Now, in his life and work, I think Albert Camus illustrates this dialectic at work. His famous letters to a German friend, Camus, who described himself as an unbeliever, not an atheist, insisted he was not an atheist. He lacked that kind of totalistic certainty. He tells a friend who is taken up with National Socialism, the Nazis think of Europe as a property to possess, while he thinks of Europe as a place within which the human person, the human soul, can find his and her being. And this latter Europe is a capacious place, a beautiful one. It is a magnificent land molded by suffering and history, he writes. I relive those pilgrimages I once made with all the men of the West, roses and the cloisters of Florence, the gilded bulbous domes of Krakow, the Hradschin and its dead palaces, the contorted statues of the Charles Bridge, the delicate gardens of Salzburg. More important, Camus' Europe is not the Europe of nihilism, within which everything reduces to the same shade of gray and no truth is to be found. His German friend believed that everything was equivalent and that good and evil could be defined according to one's wishes, and from this he drew the inevitable conclusion that the only pursuit for the individual was the adventure of power. Camus, who did not believe that the world had ultimate meaning, nevertheless held that the world was meaningful to human persons and that one was required to make judgments about right and wrong. Not all opinions are created equal. No, not all views deserve respect. And again, I'm mentioning Camus because he's in constant dialogue with Christianity. You have a couple of robust traditions that he's participating in, each an interlocutor, powerful voice. Now, what happens when Europe loses, abandons, or forgets one side of this dialogue. Okay. She winds up with a monologue, and the unbelief side becomes exaggerated and distorted into an ideology of secularism fueled by subjectivism, with the results that we have seen. She comes to believe, as did Camus' German friend. What happens when, having lost the belief side of its historic dialectic, the West loses a sense of self-confidence about her enculturating and civic mission? The first thing that happens politically is that it ceases to engage in the determined making of citizens. Ethnic communities are excluded from the broader streams of life under the rubric of an allegedly benign multiculturalism, where they fester and resent and isolation. Little is done to absorb and enculturate newer waves of immigrants who have no experience of democracy, and some of them bring with them an officially sanctioned hatred of Western culture. In Great Britain, before the attacks of July 7th, 2005, radical imams in some sections of London used the cover of religious liberty to recruit death-dealing militants who openly preached virulent anti-Semitism, scorn of democracy, and contempt for anything Western. Many members of France's Muslim community live in an angry subculture, scornful of France and of Western norms, engaged in practices that openly defy principles of human liberty and freedom, such as arranged marriages for girls as young as 11 and honor killings. And then the French government says we better do something, and it takes a determined stand against the headscarf, or decides maybe we'll ban the burqa. And resentment grows. In the Netherlands, the notion of pillarization got perverted to mean cultural isolation for the immigrant Muslim community. Now, democracies often have, as you know, a difficult task figuring out how to deal with internal threats, with those within a body politic who would destroy it if they could. And perhaps Europeans today are convinced that economic rights and expressivist self-sovereignty will carry them through. But no one can miss the signs of cultural exhaustion all around in today's Europe. Demographic collapse is one sign of this, of an existential loss of hope and a turning inward of the self, upon the self, refusing to extend the self to a child, and thus abandoning the task of formation on the most fundamental level. Now, the West suffers from many self-inflicted wounds, wounds of indifference, the wounds of self-absorption. Will Europe be able to deal with all the daunting challenges she faces, including, all you have to do is pick up the paper, destabilization, economic stagnation and unrest, a resurgence of anti-Semitism, and all the rest? And only, I would submit, if she remembers who she is, with something precious and valuable to offer, which means accepting her religious heritage. Only if Europe can sustain principles and commitments that are historically derived from presuppositions of divinely sanctioned human dignity. And I speak here of sustaining cultural memory, including that which resolutely rejects the view that we are forced to choose between faith and reason. And that, of course, would rule Europe's historical dialectic irrelevant. Absent such remembering, Europe will continue down the path of what Václav Havel has called arrogant anthropocentrism, which, he says, if you peer into that, you see the face of nihilism. Now, as you know, the current Pope has written rather extensively about this problem. And he writes one case, and the example he's citing at that point is the fact that those who abuse Judaism and Islam are shamed or fined, but when Christianity is abused, freedom of speech becomes the supreme good. And then this is what he has to say. This case illustrates a peculiar Western self-hatred that is nothing short of pathological. It is commendable that the West is trying to be more open, to be more understanding of the values of outsiders, but it has lost all capacity for self-love. All that it sees in its own history is the despicable and the destructive. It is no longer able to perceive what is great and pure. Multiculturalism, which is so constantly and passionately promoted, can sometimes amount to an abandonment and denial, a flight from one's own heritage. So Europe, he tells us, needs a new self-acceptance. A self-acceptance is critical and humble if it truly wishes to survive. Europe must reclaim what is best in its heritage and thereby place itself at the service of all humankind. So as I move to conclude, I want to suggest, if you haven't done it or haven't done it recently, that you read or reread Camus' great essay, The Rebel. It's a text that, as some of you may know, got excommunicated from French intellectual life by Sartre and those who were following Sartre. But Camus understood the dilemma, interestingly enough, that Benedict also notes, and Sartre did not. And Camus' poignant struggle, the unbeliever engaged with belief, and we would want to add, of course, the struggle of the believer engaged with unbelief, that illustrates the often brilliant dialectic and dialogue central to the European heritage. As Charles Taylor has pointed out repeatedly, Christianity is a tradition that ongoingly questions itself. That in fact, part of what Christianity deeded to the West is this self-questioning, this ongoing self-questioning. Right? But there has to be something there in order to pose the questions, right? Two. And if you lose the tradition, then there are no questions to be posed to it, no challenges to be mounted. Now, when I was an undergraduate, more than years ago, it was 40 or so, a few more, I attended a lecture by Sir Julian Huxley, a branch off the tree Huxley, proponent of secularism, enthusiastic about eugenics as part of the forward march of progress. Now, without qualification of any kind, he pronounced that by the year 2000, religion and nationalism would have disappeared, supplanted by the total victory of scientific rationality, and what would follow from that would be an entirely benign international order. This is what is known as a failed prediction. The view of the human person celebrated by Huxley was again that of the sovereign individual, ruler of his own domain. There's no soul to fret about, there's only mastery to achieve. And then you remember the spectacle a few years ago now when John Paul II lay in repose in Rome. As his body was carried into St. Peter's, the pallbearers made a circle through the crowd and then carried his body into the basilica as people wept and applauded and the litany of the saints rang out with its beautiful haunting chant that tells us we are not alone on our earthly journey. And here we witness another sort of reality, another feature, even another international order embodied. The view of the human person, celebrated in the litany of the saints and honored by the presence of millions, many of them young people who poured into Rome to celebrate and mourn, is very much that of the ensouled body. This life is exquisitely social, its meaning and purpose immanent, yet framed by the transcendent. So which represents Europe? Huxley's optimistic vision of progress unencumbered by faith and moral fretting, or John Paul II's sign of contradiction? There could scarcely be a wider gap than that between a view of human life as encompassed entirely by birth, ending definitively by death, with both birth and death increasingly under rationalistic control, that's one view, and a view of human life as a gift and a blessing, given meaning because we understand that our good is not ours alone, but a good that links us to a world of others, our brothers and sisters, though they may be foreign and strange and at times even hostile. The Europe should wind up poised between two powerful and contrasting worlds, results from no incoherence, but rather from the intrinsic telos embedded in each distinctive understanding and deeded to it by its history. Europe was defined for centuries to come up, in and through this energetic dialogue between belief and unbelief, and having lost belief, what one finds is a kind of soft nihilism. If human beings do not tend to what is good, indeed they no longer believe in any such thing, they create a vacuum into which comes that negation called evil in Christian theology, a draining away of that which is good. Evil need not take the form of the totalitarian monsters of Europe's past or the serial killers of contemporary films. It can take the form of medical practitioners killing handicapped newborns or infirm patients rather than caring for them. It can take the form of isolating and neglecting immigrants. It can take the form of ignoring antisocial behavior and cruelty until it turns into open and widespread criminality. It can take the form of an indifference that, in the name of toleration, permits a zealous minority to call for the murder of those who have drawn cartoons, however stupid those cartoons may have been, and for more suicide bombers and more killings of the innocent. The Europe Camus described, and the question is, will it be the West in toto, will one day die if, forgetting the heritage of Judaism and Christianity, she transmogrifies into something no longer recognizable as herself. In his final novel, well, there's the posthumous novel, but the final one published during his lifetime, a novel called The Fall, Camus' world-weary narrator, a fellow named Jean Bethke Elshtain, says of the modern European man, he fornicated and read the papers. That's it. Now we might say that he and she fornicated and surfed the internet. That's scarcely an improvement. And it's certainly not the stuff out of which strong and vibrant and lasting cultures are sustained. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm so happy so many of you were here. I figured everyone would be at the movies. We have time for some questions, I believe. Yes?
Yes, I'll get up so people can understand. I'm one of these Europeans, and
Yes.
I'm very grateful
Oh, thank
for
you.
your analysis.
If you'll excuse me, I'm going to sit down if that's okay. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Decay, but I would like to add a little bit of some dimensions which seem to me lacking.
Okay.
It seems to me that often when we have a certain solution in mind, the solution informs the diagnosis of the problem that we see. Mm-hmm. And so you emphasize strongly utilitarianism and the sovereign individual. Paradoxically, this is precisely what your normal, I'm an unnormal European, but what your normal Europeans will accuse America of. Because they will simply say, well, look at these Americans, they can't even give health insurance to people, they let people starve, they have no good social network. We have the Christian heritage of love for one's neighbor, wonderfully, successfully transformed into social justice and a wonderful network of solidarity. Human dignity is affirmed tremendously in the German discourse, and the reason why we decay economically and also demographically is very strongly our commitment to a secular form of human justice that overtaxes our economical possibilities, that burdens industry, that burdens all things that could grow. So in my construction, it would be much more the unconscious way in which Christians, and especially Roman Catholic and Protestant Christians, have allowed the Christian ideals to be translated into ideals of social justice, which have ruined families, discouraged people from having children, because there's no longer a sense of family if have a state solidarity community that takes care of everything, ruins our economy. So here I give the reproach back to Pope Benedict, who recently in the German Bundestag gave an address where he fully affirmed a completely secular concept of human dignity.
Thank you. Let me respond to that. I know that the theme or the term subsidiarity is often used in discussions in Europe talking about the social provision state. But it struck me for a long time that in fact the use of this term, drawn from Catholic social thought, violates really the basic principle of subsidiarity, which is that the state is there to serve civil society, not to dominate over it. And there's a problem when we repose more and more power in the state, and it begins to take up all the functions of civil society. That civil society correlatively begins to wither and to cease to do that which ideally it should do, all the way from family to churches and so on. There's a very striking new book by Robert Putnam, a political scientist named Robert Putnam, co-author David Campbell, called American Grace. And in this book, it's about 500 pages, they show, and they've taken every bit of data they can get, crunched it every way you can crunch it, but they show the findings are very robust in the social science sense, that in fact the heart of American civil society, and this is something Europeans always miss because they look at the state only when they think about us, are in fact our churches, our houses of worship. That if you look at the flourishing of networks of help and assistance and care, it comes through the social ministries of churches. And if you look at the data, those who are regular church goers are by an exponential number. I wish I had my data in front of me. I'm not good with numbers, probably why I became a political theorist. I do the empirical stuff, but a huge factor, more likely to be altruistic in their understandings of other human beings, to consider that they have a responsibility to others and so forth. They also have powerful evidence that people who were once churched, who become unchurched, become more selfish, give less time, not participate, do not care about what we would call charity and so forth. It strikes me that, again, when Europe looks at America, Europe doesn't see all of that, because for them everything has to be done from the top down through the mechanism of the state, and they don't see these other activities. Let me say something else about the European situation. I think that there's got to be more going on with what I call this existential loss of hope than the dynamic that you described in this demographic collapse. About 20 or 30 years ago, I remember a book by Günter Grass called Head Births, and the subtitle was Why the Germans Are Dying Out, something like that. And it was a story of this couple, if memory serves. It wasn't that great a novel, but it was a very instructive one, who spend endless amounts of time agonizing over whether to have one child or not. And they talk about it constantly, and then they decide, no, we've got to go on this vacation first. No, we've got to do this first. No, this has to happen first, and so forth. And there becomes a way in which their wants, and it really is their wants, take precedence. And then they finally wind up at a point where there's no point in talking about it anymore. Now, Günter Grass, being Günter Grass, doesn't go on to offer us a conclusion as to how this came about. He's describing the phenomenon itself. And I have a hunch, this is not original to me by any means, that the exhaustion of two cataclysmic wars, the horror of the Holocaust and so forth, where the darkest possibilities erupted and scarred the face of Europe, and of humankind forever, that led, in fact, to this cultural exhaustion, and rather than, or invited it, and rather than finding a way to help to revivify certain resources that might help one to deal with that and to counter it and to come to terms with it and to think of a way to try to ensure that those sorts of things never happen again, you had the emergence of this consumerist ethos. You had a lot of naming of certain things as works of solidarity, but in fact undermined real solidarity between people in the process and so forth. So you have the words being used, but the reality is simply not there. And I think that's something that I want to explore further, if what I'm saying makes some sense to you. But if I am to pursue this, I would want to look further at that, because it does strike me repeatedly about how Europeans misunderstand what goes on here. I suspect we often understand what goes on there, but I feel rather reassured simply because the analysis of the self that I've offered has been offered by certainly people who are much more brilliant and capable than I. So I think there's something to it that's worth pursuing. Oh my goodness. Let's see. I think your hand first, and the lady there, and then Tristan, and then, yes. Okay.
So we can ask our questions now?
Pardon?
Nothing. So what's your personal stance on paganism?
My personal take on paganism? Stance on paganism? Well, I've never been called upon to take a stance on paganism before. I can't imagine walking with a placard that says paganism yes or paganism no. But I would simply underscore the point that I made in the talk and that Lewis makes, which is that when you lose and forget the Christian past, you're going to lose the richness of the pagan past as well, because the two are deeply intertwined. So the notion that you could somehow leapfrog over Christianity and go back and recover the antique world in some pure form is simply ludicrous. It can't be done. So I think I will just leave it there. Certainly one could say that the world in which paganism, and there was great brilliance, obviously, St. Augustine identified it, the virtuous pagans, and so forth, in the City of God talks about that. But that world, if the world is lost, that world is certainly gone in many ways. It would be very hard to resurrect the richness, the elements that gave rise to paganism at its most robust. Very hard to sustain some of the norms that were held up, for example, in a culture that isn't primarily defined by war making, because the pagan world was a world that where what the city was there for was to make war and to have full control over both the lives of persons, the antique city, for purposes of war making and of reproduction. It was that was what cities did then, and that world, thankfully, is that part of the world. The pagan world is gone, and I think we shouldn't miss it all that much. So the politics of the pagan world is something rather brutal, as you know. But even at the same time, you had many great works, cultural works of beauty, and so forth, and certain enduring monuments to the human spirit that in fact form a part of our cultural memory, or should. So there are so many hands. I'm going to have to. I'm not going to permit a follow-up right now. You can talk to me afterwards if you want. But there are a lot of hands, and I want to get people on the table. Yeah.
So thank you for your thought-provoking remarks. I wanted to ask a question about whether you actually agree with Lewis's contention that the still sort of chasm in history is from Jane Austen to now, as opposed to, from medieval to Renaissance. Because the four things that he mentioned, the lack of agreement on vital terms, mean, all of that seems to have roots in what happens, beginning even with Occam, right? The philosophical undermining of the idea of the human person as a soul body, and the philosophical undermining of the idea that human reason can reach knowledge of ends and not just means to end, and can really attain metaphysical truth.
Sure. Thank you. Lewis's analysis, and I want to take time to develop that, is based primarily, you will have noticed, on literary examples and changes in forms of literature, rather than on philosophical changes. But I think you're quite right, that if we were to look at it philosophically, you would have to go to the nominalist revolution and to that extraordinary period of philosophical debate and rebuttal and counter-rebuttal and so on in the late medieval world. And that's something that I discuss in my book on sovereignty in some detail. And the fact that you wind up with a more voluntarist set of understandings about God as a site of will, even potentially capricious will. God could undo what God has done, rather than God as the apogee of both reason and love, which makes the world more intelligible to us. So I think you're right. There is that sort of fatal moment or fateful moment when you have that sort of nominalist turn. It was never a complete victory, ever. And you had those strands sort of continuing. But you can certainly see, I trace it in the sovereignty book, certainly see the consequences in political life, where you wind up with notions of monarchical absolutism that had not pertained at all in the medieval period, where sovereignty was considered a form primarily of responsibility rather than willful control over a body politic. So if I were doing that lecture using means I have at my disposal, I think I would track it in the terms you suggest more precisely. I think the important thing for the purpose of the talk overall is that there are momentous changes that took place that get ongoingly lost when we continue stubbornly to set up this periodization as one between these dark ages and then the flowering of knowledge. And certainly that periodization was intact when I studied history as an undergraduate. And in many of the books I read, fortunately had a professor who challenged that. But, well, let me stop. I think I've answered. Thank you. Let's see. Tristan, I think you were next. And then the gentleman here.
Thank you for a very rich presentation.
Thank you.
I'm just going to give one little sliver. And
Uh-oh. All right.
Mind. And it goes back to the dialectic between Jerusalem.
Yes. Yes.
And immediately, the way I put it is Procrustean. I mean, one way to look at Jerusalem is a God who commands. He gives 613 laws to the Jews, 7 laws to the sons of Noah. They're not compatible.
Right.
Athens wants to see everything universally. And so one tries to get a position from nowhere, not from a particular somewhere.
Yeah.
And that becomes a European aspiration.
Yeah.
That is, the Europeans' particularity is they'll have no particularity, no history, and therefore will be from everywhere. Now, once that really is in place, it evacuates everything they got from Jerusalem, and they have no content. Just desperate assertions of human dignity with any content that one could ever justify.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very helpful, and to remind me of the commentary that emerged on the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, where we had article after article defending, celebrating the Declaration for Human Rights, but no one could figure out what they're founded on. So we have one long article in the New York Review of Books, I believe it was, by Timothy Garton Ash, I think, who said, well, just sentiment will do. I think Michael Ignatieff did one that was along similar lines, that just a kind of shared sentiment would do the job and so forth. And they know that doesn't work. They know on some level that doesn't work, but there's a step that they would have to take that they're not going to take. So I think you've set up, again, another dialectic, if you will, and that is the God who commands is also, of course, a God of justice and so forth. In the story of the Israelites, we have the God of love, Jesus as embodying love. And I think another divide that's tended to emerge in our discourse is one between this we don't want God commanding anything. We don't want that sort of thing. So it's all love all the time. But then that love turns into a kind of thin sentiment. And that comports much more readily. It doesn't put much pressure on us. It comports more readily with, my determination to pretty much do what I want to do, rather than to have a God who actually judges and makes assessments. You could also parse this as, with the old philosophic themes of universality, particularity, and so forth, too. But let me just stop. That's very helpful. Thank you. Here.
To go back to the title of your talk.
Yes.
How emblematic do you think of the European crisis
Yes.
is the rise of anti-Semitism?
Oh, it's really... I think the rise of anti-Semitism, can you hear me? It's about the rise of anti-Semitism and how emblematic that is of the current moment. I think it's tremendously important and tells us a really pretty awful story, which is, again, the sort of scandal of the Jews. And I think Tristan's comments helps to put us on that path thinking about that. The Jews represent a scandal to this universalism, this thin universalism. There they are and they won't go away, and they insist on their particular identity. Why won't they be absorbed? Why won't they be assimilated? And if at one point anti-Semitism was a right-wing phenomenon, it's a left-wing phenomenon now. Really the left in Europe that preaches this really rancid anti-Semitism at the present moment. There's a book by man of the left named Nick Cohn, C-O-H-N, called What's Left, in which he goes over with great heaviness of heart, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. And you have this tremendous irony now that noted by some French Jews, for example, that in the current climate, may succeed in where Hitler failed in making Europe Rhine, because the atmosphere is so awful. And there have been, it's not, I don't know why, this would need to be explored. It's not reported as fully here as it should be. There have been coordinated attacks on synagogues and other incidents that we don't know very much about that go forward and are, alas, frequent. They're not just rare things here and there. So I would take the rise of anti-Semitism as part of this. It's not just forgetting Jerusalem, it's that we want to obliterate that and what it represents. Yes, right here. Let me stand up so I can see hands better. Yeah. Oh, is it time?
You're actually time. This is your show.
Oh, dear. Okay. What time did the next one start?
3:15.
Okay. Well, we'll take a few more questions. So go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you a question about the dialectic between belief and unbelief.
Okay.
You sort of said that Europe has lost the partner belief.
Yes.
And now it's this monologue. What would it take for Europe to sort of recover the partner belief again?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of what I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
How does Europe sort of get out of this self-loathing
Yeah.
and recover
Yeah.
this?
The question, did you hear the question? It had to do with how Europe recovers that other side of the dialectic of belief. And I know it's about time, so maybe this is a good place to conclude. I'm certainly heartened by the fact that every time there's one of those World Youth Days, the most recent, of course, Pope Benedict, the predictions always are that no kids are going to show up. No children, young people are not interested in this. They hate all the rules and restraints and regulations of the church. They're thoroughly secularized. And then, 1 million and more turn up. And most recent such event, it was pouring rain. You had 1 million plus young people sort of kneeling in the mud, for mass and so forth. That tells us something. I mean, it tells us that there's a spirit and a yearning there, one that is fragile, it seems to me, because there's so much sort of pushing against it. But nevertheless, it's there. And my friend Cardinal George likes to say to me, you know, don't forget the Holy Spirit work. And I tell him I can't factor that in, you know, to my analyses. But I suppose it's a good point I want to end. You know, don't forget that the Holy Spirit is at work. So perhaps in some unexpected ways, you know, we'll see this revivification of the other side of the dialogue. Thank you all very much. Thank you.